Hello everybody. So I wanted to answer a report that I saw that shared on Facebook that said it was from historians and so forth that were claiming that Donald Trump, that USA under Donald Trump is becoming more like an autocracy and away from being a democracy. So I wanted to answer that. Now, of course, Trump's only been in power for 2 months. And you might think, well, that's possible. It could go that way. It could be that awful. But we've got to remember that he was also in power for 4 years. And USA didn't become an autocracy in those 4 years. And you'd think if they were going to, they would have gone further in 4 years than they would in 2 months. So that sort of suggests that it's a bit absurd. The other thing I wanted to mention from the outset is USA is not a democracy. That's one thing I want to mention. USA is a republic. Okay, it doesn't call itself a democracy. It calls itself a republic, and that's the correct term. So what that means, the difference between a republic and a democracy. So if you see a lot of democratic countries, for example my own Australia, and Australia is a socialist democracy by the way, it's a type of democracy. And what we do is that when we vote as a country. Now, USA don't. Okay? So we vote as a country, the same rules for every part of the country. It doesn't matter if you were voting in Tasmania or Queensland, you would get the same exact rules, the same size of voting electorates and so forth. Well, that's not the case in USA. In USA, potentially every state has a different rule for how to vote and how they count the votes and for all the rest. Now each of those individual states are democracies, but they each have their own laws that determine what kind of a democracy they are. And some of them can be quite different to each other. So what this means overall is that when it comes to the election, USA is not a democratically elected nation. They're a republic. Now that doesn't make it any less fair. It just becomes complicated because you've got 50 different versions, literally 50, so 50 different states that have different versions for what kind of democracy they want, and then they're all coming together. Now that's sort of similar to multinational groups like, let's say, the United Nations. Now United Nations, the individual members are not all democracies. Some are, some aren't. Some are republics, some are monarchies, some are dictatorships. And they all get to vote within there. And they get one vote per member regardless of the size of it. Some of them have 37,000 people, some of them have 1 billion. And they all get one vote. So it's not a very fair democracy. It's a republic, and the United States Republic is not a very fair democracy, but it's one that all the individual states agree to. Not necessarily equally, because they're not equal, and how they work it out is never going to be completely fair. The republic system is a compromise. It's never going to be a democracy. It's not as fair as a democracy, but and I think when you look at republics, they're always going to be quite corrupt because the version of fairness in one state or one part of the republic is going to be different to the version of fairness in somewhere else. And that means that if you don't like a law, you just go to another state. And I mean, there are certain national laws, but certainly not when it comes to voting. And yeah, so calling USA a democracy is rather dishonest. So we have to bear that in mind when we're talking about it going from a democracy to an autocracy when it wasn't a democracy to start with. And I know, look, around the world we have different versions for what is a democracy. Here in Australia we're a socialist democracy, and Australia is in fact a federated colony. We're not an independent nation. We belong to the United Kingdom. We're not the only country that still belongs to somewhere else. Colonialism hasn't ended. It's not as widespread as it once was, and there are independent nations. We're not one of them. And in theory, here in Australia, which we uphold true democracy, our particular version of one, which has a preferential voting system, we can be overturned at any time by the United Kingdom, who is a monarchy. And we can have all our votes, get people in fairly, and then have it completely overturned by the King, as it is right now, King Charles III, through the Governor General. The Governor General can just do it. And they did it once before, and they could do it any time. I'm not saying for any reason, there are certain rules about it, but yeah. So every democracy has flaws, but at the same time, the United States is not a democracy. Is it heading towards autocracy? Well, one problem is the article I read said, such as Russia. Now, such as Russia, Russia's a poor choice. They should have said such as North Korea. North Korea is an autocracy. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. That North Korea has a supreme leader as the head that's essentially like a king, but even more. And basically like a god, and it's similar to how the Egyptians did their pharaohs at certain parts during the ancient Egypt. Some of the more extreme versions of ancient Egypt. So so he's essentially a god, a supreme leader, and that's an autocracy. How far along is Russia? Well, a lot of people would say Russia is an autocracy, but these are people that are coming from Russia's enemies, such as USA, who have a vested interest in making Russia sound bad, or sound worse than that. Let's look at the reality. So, first of all, Putin has been either Prime Minister or President since 1999. So that's a period of 26 years. Does this automatically make him an autocratic leader? No. There are a number of democratically elected leaders around the world that do have 20-year terms, 26-year terms. And he wasn't president the whole of that time. So he's been president, I think it's 15 years, and he's been Prime Minister for 11. So, hasn't always been complete top, but still. So we're talking 15, 16 years, quite a long time. There have been Australians who have been Prime Minister, which is as high as we get in Australia, for longer periods than that. We didn't call them autocratic leaders. Didn't call John Howard an autocratic leader. And, there's that alone doesn't make them an autocracy. It just means that they don't have the term limits that USA have, or they have a different system. Now, what potentially does make it autocratic-like is that Russia have gone around and arrested political leaders. And they have. So that's not a good thing. And that is autocracy-like. The USA kind of did that themselves, but not through Trump's leadership, through Biden's. Because when they were arresting and charging Donald Trump, they were acting a bit like an autocracy. Now, thankfully, Trump wasn't prevented from running. That would have made them much more of an autocracy, but there are still whispers. So we actually think they were becoming more like an autocracy under Biden than under Trump. And this is where we've got ourselves a bit confused. Thankfully, it didn't go the whole way. He was allowed to run, and in fact, he became leader. Good for them. But if you're comparing it with Russia, they were closer under Biden than under Trump. So that's a bit of a problem for people that want to blame it all on Trump. It's not Trump's fault that he was being politically targeted. Now, we also need to note that a lot of people who are blaming Trump are saying, well, we're defending democracy in Ukraine, and I want to just point out Ukraine have deleted all of their political opponents and their entire parties, which is a lot worse than what USA did with Trump, so under Biden, and a lot worse than anything Russia's done. Russia has not deleted a whole political party. Not only that, but Ukraine's deleted any parties, ideologically, any parties that are pro-Russia. And if you want to look at who they voted for before they started doing that, so from 1991 to 2014, about 93% of the votes cast in that 23-year period were for pro-Russia parties. So we're deleting 93% of the options. So essentially you'd be saying, all right, well, we're going to ban both Liberal and Labor, our two major parties. You're going to have to vote for Clive Palmer's party or Pauline Hanson's party. They're both quite extremist parties. And it's told, well, they're your two options. That's essentially what Ukraine's done, and they've gone further down that rabbit hole. So I think if you were comparing them, who is more autocratic, you'd say Ukraine. But we're not talking about Ukraine. You'd also say more autocratic like under Biden than under Trump. Because under Biden they tried to get rid of the political leader, tried to get rid of Trump. Under Trump they haven't tried to get rid of the political leader. Maybe they will in the future, but they're not at the moment. So we're having a few issues here. Now this is not to say that Russia doesn't have some aspects of autocratic-like leader, but we also got to realise that under Putin he can't just do whatever he wants, because we know quite well that he is at risk of assassination at any time. There are groups of people who disagree with him, who are in powerful positions. He's not an absolute leader at all. In fact, it's been often stated that if he were to withdraw from Ukraine, he would be assassinated. And there are groups that are very, very powerful in Russia that would assassinate him and would take over the leadership. So the fact that that's there, it's widely accepted as true, suggests that he's not actually an autocrat in any meaningful way at all. Of course, neither's Trump. Trump can't just do what he likes. He lost the election. Now, granted, we've got all these claims that it wasn't quite fair, but at the end of the day, he lost that election. So he's not just winning everything, and in fact, he tried to do a lot of things in 2016, was knocked back. Now he's trying to do things, and the judges are knocking him back. They're not hallmarks of an autocracy. Trying to get Doge to stop spending seems perfectly reasonable, and people are pushing back on that. None of that suggesting it's autocratic. So the bit that suggests that USA became more autocratic was under Biden. Now you can say, well, it wasn't Biden's fault that they went after Trump, that was someone else's. But that was an autocratic-like move. So which country is more like an autocracy? Well, you would have to say Russia is more like an autocracy than USA. USA was more autocracy-like under Biden than under Trump. Either term of Trump, we've got to say. Because of the aims at the political opponents under Biden. And that political opponent being Trump. So we have to say that. Now, I mean, there are people that say, well, what about when Trump tried to go after Hunter Biden? Well, that was Hunter Biden, that wasn't Joe Biden, and Joe Biden wasn't actually an opponent at that stage. He did become one. And also, that was legitimate. So, yeah, there is an argument that that was a little bit autocracy-like, but again, it was pushed back, there was an impeachment, it was stopped, and it was true. So you'd say that was a lot less autocratic than what Biden did, because he was reasonably successful. Had fraudulent cases brought, exaggerated cases that they had to change the laws to make that. Now you could say Biden didn't do that. Well, maybe he personally might not have, it's all a bit grey. Certainly we're not seeing that now. Nothing like that now. Now, if you wanted to say, are USA becoming more corrupt? I think USA's been corrupt for a long time now. Power corrupts. They've been the most powerful country in the world since 1949, and solo since 1991. Say USA's been the most corrupt country in the world for most of that time. Might have shared it with USSR, and look, I'd say right now Russia's probably second, although the things going on in Ukraine, because they're sort of competing with both, mean that Ukraine's potentially ahead of both of them, but only for the duration of the war. I think once the war ends, Ukraine will drop back a bit. But I certainly say they're the three most corrupt countries in the world, but the most autocratic of them is Ukraine. But the most autocratic country in the world is North Korea, which is more like an autocracy out of Ukraine and Russia. I'd probably say Ukraine, but again, it can be fixed, so it's more temporary than Russia's is. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye bye now.